So if people would like to maybe introduce themselves in the chat, if you go down, there is a chat function. And that could just say your name, where you're from, your pronouns, acknowledgement perhaps of the indigenous peoples who were and hopefully still are where you are.
Paulus, Montclair,
So Trina, we're asking
St.
people
Peter Claver Church.
Wait, Trina.
The Grail International Movement.
Trina, wait.
Trina. Peace Action, New Jersey.
Trina, I'm asking people to do it in the chat, to add your information in the chat. And yeah, it's 7:04. I'd say let's give one more minute and we will begin. It's good to see people. Thanks for getting on the call. Actually, maybe just I could just say a little bit briefly. Most people probably know a lot of this, but 350 New Jersey Rockland has been around, I think, close to 10 years now, at least 8 or 9 years. It was begun by people primarily in Bergen County who had some connections to people in Rockland County, which is kind of how this became 350 New Jersey Rockland. And we have been active, organizing, supporting, working with other groups. Two of our major focuses, and this has been true for several years, have been fighting against the fossil fuel projects, which in New Jersey are basically a frack gas coming through from Pennsylvania, and pipelines, compressor stations. There's a proposal to build an export terminal in southern New Jersey to export frack gas around the world. And we've been very much part of a very strong movement that has won victories and is definitely jamming up the 7 existing projects that are going much more slowly than the proposers wanted. And we have chances of defeating some of them, maybe all of them, who knows. So we've been very active with that movement, and then we've also played a leading role in the divestment campaign, Divest New Jersey, trying to get the state pension fund to divest from fossil fuels. Those have really been our 2 major things, and then we of course work with other groups and connect as we can. So I think it's good to see the screen filled again. There'll probably be some more folks coming, but I think it'd be good to start. So let me just introduce Jeff, and our basic format is pretty simple. Jeff is going to speak for 20 or so minutes. I'm going to introduce him. He'll speak for 20 or so minutes, and then we'll open up for people's comments and questions. Jeff actually is somebody, I think we probably interacted before, but my first real working experience with Jeff was just about a year ago when I went to West Virginia, and there was an action that happened at Joe Manchin's coal plant that he makes $500,000 a year from, Coal Baron Manchin. There was an action at his coal plant, including nonviolent direct action, people blocking the entrance. And Jeff was one of the main organizers of that action. It was a good one. It definitely had an impact at the time, and helped to expose Joe Manchin for what he really is. In terms of his history, this is kind of what was said already, but let me remind people from the email we sent out. He has been an organizer and an activist since 1987. Working on LGBT rights, labor and community issues, and the climate crisis. He worked as an organizer for the Service Employees International Union, for the community organizing group ACORN, where he was the Midwest director in 2003, with the Occupy movement, with Rising Tide, North America, and other groups. And last year, he was chosen to be National actually 350 North America's director. So without any further ado, thanks a lot, Jeff, and we look forward to hearing from you. I think a lot of people on this call really don't know very much about 350's history nationally, internationally, really. So we're looking forward to learning from you and hearing about what 350 North America is doing now, planning to do.
Great. Hey, comrades, happy May Day, and very glad to be here. Wait, Ted, can I ask you a quick question then? Because I know this was billed in the emails talking about an intersectional climate movement, but is it more to fill folks in on what we're doing at 350 and a little bit of both, maybe?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks and appreciate y'all taking the time to be here tonight. I'm Jeff Ordower, new to 350, so I can't do the history as well as some of you all have been around much longer. But obviously been adjacent to it for a number of years and was very excited to come and work for 350 more formally, precisely because we are trying to cohere a global climate movement. I wanted to talk a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about that. And Ted doesn't remember, but we met in like 1996 or 7 in the Hill Country in Texas when there was a meeting of like folks trying to build third parties, and Acorn was trying to build a new majority party. Ted heads up some kind of group for green parties and other things, and had some very helpful advice for me then. So I know you don't remember that encounter, but I do. So yeah, good to be reconnected in the last couple of years. So a couple things, maybe I'll take this in 2 parts. So first was this question of like, what should we be doing to build an intersectional climate movement? And I'm actually going to argue that in the US right now, we are making and have made, great strides toward an intersectional climate movement. And part of that, and this is, I'm going to say some things that you may disagree with, so it'd be good in the discussion to like lift that up. I'm pretty comfortable with some give and take. But here's the premise, which is, I think that in the last decade, we are still a divided climate movement in terms of who is organizing in what containers, but we are pretty unified in the sense that what has been great over the 6 months that I've been North America director at 350.org is the opportunity to talk to so many local groups that are all volunteer run and that are predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly white folks, often folks who are, my age or a little bit older. And the way in which people are doing internal work around racism, around racial justice, is really, really inspiring to me. Like how much work people have done. Some people have done it their whole lives. Some people have been politicized either during the Ferguson uprising or subsequently, or during the uprising in the wake of the murder of George Floyd a couple summers ago. But I'm really inspired by the work that folks are doing to have a reckoning with race in the US and how that relates to our work. And I've also been pretty inspired by how much I think we collectively are, and again, Standing Rock and the fight there really moved issues of Indigenous sovereignty to the forefront, but how much we're centering Indigenous communities, Indigenous leadership, BIPOC leadership, folks on the front lines, on the fence line, and in Indigenous lands. And I think that's a practice and a direction that we're moving in that has made this work, that we're really making great strides towards an intersectional climate movement. And I think there's some additional things, obviously, we need to do, but I think I just want to give even an example, like the Sierra Club. Some of what they have been doing over the last 7 or 8 years, I think they've often been better on racial justice than they have on issues of climate change. Like they talk about that much less. But when they send out emails about racial justice, having their whole staff go through, they're very focused on like, we need to stop this coal plant. They don't talk about climate change more broadly. But the stuff that when Mike Brune was the director sent out to the membership, I found that like pretty agitational and pretty inspiring. So I think the climate movement is sort of moving in that direction. And not just what they've done, but also like Mike Brune's work at the Sierra Club and now with Ben Jealous, what they've done to create the cabals of groups of climate leadership inside DC. They've broken up what was a group of 10 organizations that was just like white climate groups that were insiders, and they turned that into a much broader group with much more diverse representation for deciding sort of the voice of climate leadership in the country. But I think there's three things that we need to do, I think, to further sort of how we're building an intersectional climate justice movement. So the first is, I think those of us who have some privilege increasingly need to be using it as best as we can, and in as provocational and sort of direct a way that we can. And I think that is what we're seeing in the US, and we're seeing this around the world too, is government repression on frontline climate defenders in so many ways, right? We're seeing that about half the states in the US now have critical infrastructure laws. So what that means is that if you're going to, if you're trying to interfere with a pipeline and do direct action or something else that's deemed to be critical infrastructure, you're facing felony counts. And that's pretty serious. And what that's doing is chilling out, or sort of creating a chilling climate for a lot of groups, in talking with groups in the Gulf who want to resist the huge amount of fossil fuel expansion that's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. Those groups that are predominantly BIPOC-led are nervous about taking direct action. And I think those of us who have some privilege need to challenge some of those critical infrastructure laws. We're seeing this in the wake of what's happening in Atlanta with Cop City, that what we've seen very clearly is, a law that was taken to be able to prosecute actual terrorists, right? This was in the wake of Dylan Roof's shooting of parishioners and his cold-blooded murder of Black parishioners in South Carolina. They created a domestic terrorism law. That is the law that is being used to lock people up who are resisting the construction of this training center. I don't know how familiar folks are with Cop City. I imagine some of you are, but what's happening in Atlanta, in the largest sort of forest cover in Atlanta, is they're digging this out, and it's sort of related to gentrification. So it's related to displacement of some poor and working class Black folks in the neighborhood, but there's gentrification as a piece of this. Is they're also building a police training center. So they're cutting down forests, building a police training center where they hope to train police from all over the world. So I'm looking at folks around the room. I bet some folks were active in School of the Americas and other protests, seeing folks from Peace Action. It's very similar. It's sort of hoping to be a national or international police training center. And building that, there's been two forms of resistance. There's been a Black-led group, Community Movement Builders, and others who have been resisting, trying to move through the processes of Atlanta City Council. And then there have been folks who have been engaged in forest defense. And those folks have been, when they're being arrested, one was murdered in January, so Tortuguita, and other people, when they're jailed, are being held on domestic terrorism charges, even though they posed no threat to other humans. So what we know is that the ante continues to get upped, and we need to use our privilege that we have to be able to put ourselves and challenge those laws and put our bodies on the line. And I believe that very strongly. The second thing is we do need to have more of a global and sort of, a global view of what's happening. So I think we're a little bit too focused in the US about what we need to be doing to fight climate change here. And really, what's happening, obviously, we all know this theoretically, but what we do in practice is a little bit different in terms of, so we need to do a couple of things. One is we need to, think about how we're doing our role in the belly of the beast to diminish the power of the US and how it is moving internationally, and particularly what the US is or isn't doing about reining in the power of both fossil fuel companies and finance capital, racial finance capital, and its impacts on projects and development in the global South. And I think that's absolutely key. And that's why I'm really excited about what we're doing as 350.org to think about this more on a on an international level and a global level is instead of, so a couple of things have happened recently in the organization in the last year, and it's particularly why I came to 350. The first is, it used to be, because this was an organization that was started in the US, that the US was sort of the driver of policies and program. And now that's being driven by groups in the global South. So we're in 28 countries, and the Latin America team, the Asia team, the Africa team are the ones that are driving our fights. And so our job in the US is really to support that. We need to run, yes, we're running separate programs in the US, but we also need to figure out what we're doing to support those struggles. And there's a couple particular fights I can send follow-up information on. One is the East African crude oil pipeline going through Uganda, Tanzania, a bunch of countries in East Africa. Total Energies out of France is the main driver of that, but there's a lot of other groups that are participating, including some insurers, an insurer named Marsh that's participating here in the US. So there's some fights there, and we're trying to lift up those struggles. And the second big struggle that 350 and 350's allies are fighting is in Argentina's Vaca Muerta, which is just a giant gas extraction process in Argentina that everyone thinks is going to happen. Chevron is a big player in that. Again, a lot of European oil companies are big players as well, and we're trying to figure out how we can support that. And then the third piece of that programming is, what are we doing around big events like the G7, which is happening in Japan in a couple of weeks, and other sort of international things that we're lifting up the struggles of what folks are fighting for. And obviously, I think for those of you who've been around in 350 for a while, the Pacific Climate Warriors are the key group that many folks know about, and how they've taken their struggle around the world and really lifted it up at COP after COP. And so what we've added to the staff, and I'm happy to make connections for folks who are interested in getting particularly involved in our international work, is we've added an organizer who's done some work with the School of the Americas Watch, spent many years living in Colombia, doing accompaniment work. But he's someone whose job is to create political education and really figure out how we're participating as a US movement, as US 350, in supporting what's being driven from the global South. And the second piece of that, that I think is really interesting about how we're shifting globally, is folks want to be thinking more about solutions work too. And so, and I'll get to that, there's a US component to this, but one of the things that's interesting about the solutions work is we're talking about lots of areas. Like we just had a directors meeting in January in the Philippines. Many areas don't have access to electricity. And so the idea that you could create both where there is real need, sort of iconic renewable energy, solar technology, you can create solar packs, you can train people on building their own, all of those things. So that's one piece of sort of the smaller level, what can we do to create renewable energy? And the second is, how do we think in a bigger way about removing barriers to to large scale, but really community centered and community owned renewable energy. And so that's what we're thinking about, is what's our role in pushing US institutions to clear the barriers from countries in the global South. And then the second is, what can we do at home? And so that's going to be my third point, which I think is about using our privilege. So I'll sort of stop there on like our global strategy, but happy to talk more about it in question and answer. But the third piece is, when we say, and we sometimes do, that we are an organization that is, predominantly white climate activists, and our goal is to organize as many of us as we can. Like, we're not saying we should be small and we should be elite. Like, what's exciting is we have, the Rockland chapter is one of 100 local groups of 350. Some of them, and there's another 12 organizations that are full organizations that have staff within the Network Council of 350. And that's exciting, and we need to go even bigger than that. And we should think about who and where we're organizing, because that's important too, because if we're a project that is organizing the kind of like base and traditional membership that 350 has, that's great. And some of the only other groups in the US that are organizing white folks, are organizing middle-class white folks and some working-class white folks, is the authoritarian right. And that's a real struggle, and we need to be engaged in that struggle. So it's less important to me, very important, obviously, activists and folks who are in progressive centers, but also, how do we think about, this is what we're trying to figure out programmatically, which is how do we think about how we're organizing in places where we're really creating an alternative to the authoritarian right? How do we do that? And is the Inflation Reduction Act a way to do that? So does it mean that because we have the ability to, all schools can get direct pay, we're still waiting exactly on the guidelines to come out, but they'll get money back for putting in, solar technology. Does that help ameliorate some of the conditions of super hot classrooms for kids? Does that show the parts of the IRA show that government can work? And so we want to think about that. So that's one piece, is both IRA implementation directly and how and where do we do that? And then there's a second thing, which is how do we use some of the fights around the IRA and eliminating barriers in the US to an energy transition? Can that be sort of a cross-cutting issue? So I'll give you my last example, which is we're doing some experiments in utilities organizing. And our hunch is that utilities are a problem for everyone, right? So first, there are technical issues. Utilities are blocking renewables from getting on the grid, and they're using this horrible mix. So they're staying on coal. They're building. I was just in Wisconsin a couple of weeks ago, and somehow Minnesota, to get to net zero, is authorizing the construction of a fracked gas plant in Wisconsin. I don't know how the heck that gets you to net zero, but that's sort of like kind of the things that they game out. They're like, transition to gas gets us to net zero somehow. So there's a set of things that we need to do that are direct fights about the energy mix. The second thing is there's a lot of folks who are installing, trying to install solar. Again, energy companies, utility companies are keeping folks from selling that back on the grid, from getting what they need to get. And then there's the third thing, which is poor and working class people can't afford their bills. And then, of course, there's like this investor strategy versus public ownership of utilities. So we think if we can build a big movement, and our assessment is a lot of groups that do base building community organizing are not in the utility space right now. And the reason they're not because they don't want to be, but because they're directly trying to keep their folks from getting evicted. Because there's just so much crisis happening around that, around rents, around corporate landlords. So we think it's a space that's a good space for us to occupy that puts us a little bit more on organizing footing. So I think that's what we're doing to try to build the intersectional climate movement, is looking for those partnerships, thinking about it's not just intersectional in terms of the US, but also globally as well. And then finally, we're trying to figure out really both who we organize and how we take folks who are active, like many of you. We want you to both, how can we support the Rockland chapter and what are you doing? And we do have, if you haven't connected with Lila Corman Glazer, she is our network manager. And so our job is to figure out programming and figure out connections for local groups and how you get access to what we need. But also how we put ourselves more on organizing footing, so that when we think about how do we identify within our membership folks who are willing to step up and take additional risks when there are scaled actions or when there are actions that are challenging things? How do we find folks who have experience in international work or come out of different movements that want to support how we're thinking about political education to make ourselves a more global and anti-imperialist organization in the US? So there's a set of those kinds of things that we're trying to think about, and how to think about how we really meet. So I'm really grateful to be here, how we find people who want to get involved and think about how folks can directly get involved in some of the work of .org more specifically. So yeah, I feel like I've taught at you a lot, and now let's have some discussion, and who knows if I said what I was supposed to say or not.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I see a couple of hands up, which is great. Sam, I think it'd be good for the questions and discussion if we could all see each other instead of just there we go. Thanks a lot. Okay, so I see Jordan and David. I do want to I mean, actually, I very much believe in what's called progressive stack, where we encourage a man and then a woman, etc. People of color. There are not many, I believe, on this call, but people of color who are on this call, if they want to speak, they get preference, frankly. Young people, etc. So that's kind of the way I'm going to call on people. try to look for have a progressive approach to who speaks. But we'll have our first two questions, our comments from Jordan Dale and then David Hughes. So Jordan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions, but I'm going to ask one and hope that I get a chance to ask the second one later. I've been a 350 member supporter donor for a while, and I know 350 National went through some internal upheaval. And I'm wondering, because it's been confusing for me, if you could explain a little bit about what happened, what the problem was, and how it got fixed.
So I didn't know if you were taking two questions or not.
I think you should go ahead, Jeff.
I'm saving question number 2 for later, so I make sure everybody gets to ask question 1 before I ask question 2.
Yeah, we really appreciate you being a longtime donor and supporter. I think there's no, I mean, I wasn't there, so there's no easy answer. I'll say a couple things. First of all, I think, there was a wave of conflict that happened in 350 in 2019 when there was a misassessment about money coming in. And so they sort of overshot and thought that they were on more stable financial footing than we were. And there was, they had to lay off a significant number of folks, and that created a set of, obviously mistrust for leadership and sort of a financial hole. And so that was a problem. And, that set off a bunch of some concurrent things. Obviously, I don't know how much folks have been tracking this, but within the kind of progressive movement, there have been many organizations have had lots of internal conflict, particularly under pandemic conditions and conditions with, with not just the pandemic, but what's happened with the uprisings. And so 350 was not immune from that. And that was like a second piece of the puzzle. And yeah, I think, a lot of very good people left. It was definitely, I think people left for a variety of reasons. And again, I've been here 6 months. I'm not trying to pass the buck. But what I can say is that, I think very painful internal time for the organization. I think some of it was folks are characterizing it as a way, as like 350 sort of started, some college students, and Bill McKibben started 350 in 2000, somewhere 2007 to 2009, no matter how you count it. And so then all of a sudden they had like staff person in Africa and a staff person somewhere else, and they were trying to create a global organization, and most folks hadn't actually managed an organization and had no idea what it took to do that. And we're sort of building the plane as it was flying. And they really used, the last couple of years to try to cohere and realign a global organization where that was like based on, having real clear internally processes and a clearly named executive team and not having informal power. But the way they brought folks on is it was like a pretty freewheeling organization. And so a lot of folks, were used to doing whatever they wanted and didn't really want to be part of a larger structure. So there was a set of, internal conflict around race and who was leading the organization. There was an internal conflict around realignment to prioritize the global South. So it was significant, also reduction in staff. Like the US staff was, 50 or 60 people. And now what we're going to have max is like 10 or 11 staff in the US as part of this like reconstitution of what we've got, at least at .org, right? There's lots of other 350 staff, both in the world and in the US working for state groups. So yeah, I think we're out the other end, or I'm very confident that we are, but I know it was a very painful time. And, I think the last thing is many organizations have had some labor management conflict, and 350 was part of that. And I believe we're very close to having a contract with the staff union that we're very excited about. So we're coming very close to the finish line there, but that was another piece of the puzzle as well. So yeah, I don't want to it was pretty serious. And I think lots and lots of factors. And if you ask anyone, I have lots of people, lots of comrades who used to work at 350 and they had different takes. And I think folks can sort of fill you in on what their individual questions were. And I talked to a number of people before I took the job who were ex-350 staff about whether or not I should come to work at 350. And everyone, actually, even people who had left on not great terms, thought that it was a good time to rebuild. But yeah, it was a serious, there was a serious loss of functions and work in the US.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So David is next, David Hughes. I see James Friedman, I see your hand, so I definitely have you on the list. Again, with Progressive Stack, it'll be David and then Judith and then James. So go ahead, David.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Ted. And good to meet you, Jeff. I'm coming to you from the Climate Justice Task Force of the American Federation of Teachers. I have a question. I hear your call for people with privilege who tend to be white and wealthy in the US to step up, to take the risk through arrest actions, through civil disobedience. And I get that. How do you then avoid the problem of a bunch of white saviors being the heroes of this movement and marginalizing everybody else?
Jeff?
Yeah, well, and first of all, I also think what the AFT is what teachers unions are doing right now is a front line against and good to meet you too, David, but just a front line against what's happened both post-pandemic and in all of that. It's a serious problem that we're at, is how much teachers and teachers unions are being vilified. And I know the AFT has been at the forefront, and the NEA the forefront of that. I don't think it's about being white saviors. I don't think we should just be I think there are some places where we should be doing actions, because they're the right places to do actions, but really the actions need to be rooted in relationships with organizations. So when I say the Gulf, I think there's an invitation from some groups in the Gulf for folks to potentially take farther action. I know that there was, I was part of the Treaty People gathering up at Line 3 a couple of years ago, and certainly Indigenous leadership was calling for folks to take increased risk there. So where there are frontline groups, yeah, I'm not saying folks should be white saviors and show up and do stuff. What I'm saying is that needs to be in relationship with groups that are on the front lines and on the ground. But I also think we're not particularly good. It's clunky in terms of we don't know. I think many of us are less willing to take those risks even when the opportunity is there, and to ask the kind of questions that may be about, what we can do with our privilege. But yeah, absolutely, we shouldn't just be showing up in places. And, even the action that Ted refers to, we spent a lot of time building an organizing committee of West Virginians in West Virginia to think that action was an appropriate action to do.
Okay, Judith?
Okay. This morning in the New York Times, there was an editorial, or I guess was an op-ed about defending nuclear energy, very strongly defending it. What is the 350.org stance on nuclear energy?
Yeah, and I think that goes with Marianne's question in the chat too around lithium. We're against nuclear energy. We're against sort of consumption of we're against we're against biomass. We're against nuclear. We're against things that we see, carbon sequestration, things that we see as false solutions. Globally, we've been developing and work a set of guardrails around how we think about our work. So that means things that we're opposed to, and basically in consultation with partners around the world, and then also about sovereignty over land. So around lithium, so much lithium is being mined on, not just in the US, but on indigenous land in the global South as well. And there's conflicts around that in Chile, as I understand, potentially in Bolivia. and certainly the sovereignty of those states to be able to determine what happens with their natural resources. So we believe very strongly in that. And that's where we come down, and we're pretty clear about those things, and we'll be developing, and we'll be much more public in the next month or two about those guardrails. And we understand there may not be 100% consensus within 350 about what needs to happen. I think we see ourselves as, creating, this is what our consultation is globally, and what we believe is necessary, and because there'll be lots and lots of groups that are ready to strike a compromise, and we don't think, we think we need to be clear about where we stand and where we're going.
Okay, thanks. James Friedman, please unmute.
Thanks, Ted. I just want to say hello to Jane, who sent me this email. We belong to the same progressive organizations back in the early 70s, and we taught in the same school for a while in Brooklyn. So my question is this, as far as funding for 350.org, do you accept any money from fossil fuel industry or any front groups aligned with fossil fuels?
No.
Thank you.
That was easy. Excellent. Winnie, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I do.
Okay, you're next then.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. And my name is Winifred Victor Hines, and I am with the Newark Environmental Commission here in Newark, New Jersey, and also Weequahic Park Association. And thank you for doing this. And Jeff, a lot of what you said resonated with me. And I'm trying to wrap around my head around what is it I really want to say, because there are so many thoughts going on. And these days, I'm a bit disillusioned with the environmental movement here in the US. And I've worked with social justice and environmental justice issues overseas in Latin America. And there was a strong sense of solidarity and trust. And I don't know if it was because it seemed a lot more dangerous at the time. And what you mentioned, now it's starting to sound like in the direction that it's heading, the way South America is and also was, in terms of the, being labeled a terrorist, et cetera, because so many environmentalist activists are killed every year, throughout the world. And so here it seems as if, and that even goes for, BIPOC activists, nonprofit leaders, that they're more interested in the funding, and they're sort of timid about making waves, about shaking the system. And there's sort of a desperation in terms of the funding. And it seems as if it's gotten worse with the whole IRA funding, that's come about. And there's also a tendency, to try to make a certain leader, like a handpicked leader or a little celebrity, or, and the whole mission is sort of pushed aside. And so you also get little sound bites, whereas people who are doing, like the grunt work and, who are sticking their necks out, they get tend to be pushed aside. And so when you were talking, a lot of it, it seemed to me, it went in my head like bullet point. Yep. Okay. Yeah, that's what I noticed. Okay. Yeah, good. And when you mention solutions and actual actions, that's also what frustrates me. It seems as if there's a lack of creativity sometimes as to how we can actually find solutions and actions in order to actually make a difference. And so that's my frustration. And so, I just wanted to put it out there, and then just I guess support a bit of what you were saying, that some of us do notice it, and some of us actually do have some solutions, and we do want to make actions, but we can't find the support because it's too, I wouldn't say dangerous, but it's too risky, to support those of us who are willing, to stick our necks out, and who are willing, to suffer the consequences, so to speak. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, Winifred, I just wanted to echo, I agree with all of that. I think the only thing I would reflect is, I feel like the level at which money plays a role in how we make decisions. I think what's been interesting about being at 350.org is we are not unlike other groups where it's not just who we get money from, but it's that is our programming is what we can do influenced by particular grant makers. And the answer to that is no. And so that's what's exciting. But also there's just this question in the US climate movement, there's so many organizations are funded and are cognizant of their funding and the commensurate levels of risk that they can take, that it's really complicated. And it's hard. I think we are unique in the sense that we really have a lot of paid staff for a movement what we consider to be a social movement, whereas I think most countries don't. And so they have more real social movements, and that's a contradiction within the US. And then the final, I think, thinking back on what you said is the interesting thing about solutions work, if we do it well, is that it causes us to ask more fundamental questions about our economy, about how it works. And so hopefully we can use that to open the door to those kinds of things. So I don't know, I think we don't know what that is, but I think we've got our ears and our eyes open that the solutions work takes us in a direction that isn't just about how we convert energy systems, but also that's intertwined with how we convert economic systems.
And also I'd like to add, and for the white privilege also, that, as white people, you have to be willing to take the risk to help us out also. You can't just pay lip service. You actually have to act and, treat us as equals, let us choose if we do want to sit at the table or not. And just make sure that you support us when we ask you to.
Thanks, Winnie. Thanks a lot. Thanks for being on the call and speaking up.
Thank you.
So I'll call the next three people. Even though Jordan has spoken before, because he was so considerate to only ask one question, you're getting a break and you're going to the.
Actually, I'm going to be
line.
respectful of your leadership, Ted, and I'm going to defer to Trina and Jane,
Okay.
neither of whom have spoken yet.
Okay, very good. So you'll be third then. So Trina, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that you invited us to get in touch with you, and I want to know how, and I'm sure Ted knows how. And we very much associate with one another because I belong to an international movement called the Grail that's actually Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and South Africa. And so we're in touch right now with them, and it's so parallel, it seems to me, to what you're doing. And in my question to you is, what is 350 right now pushing in terms of solutions? Because I'm very tired of the push for solar panels and windmills, which can't be recycled when they end up not able to do anything more. And the lack of what I don't hear very much about is geothermal and wave energy, which would be much less heavy on the environment. And also the problem of the sequestration of carbon dioxide that organic agriculture gives, that has been mostly not paid attention to within the climate movement from the very beginning, when I used to go to those meetings with Al Gore and all, coming from the Al Gore movie. They just didn't even have that in their vocabulary or thought about the importance of properly raised food as organic land, as absorbing and being able then to use again both water and the carbon. And the kind of thing we have right now with Bill Gates now being the largest landholder in the United States, using green language to help climate change, but trying to put us all on synthetic food. That's not food. So what is the position in these big things of 350 right now?
Yeah, I mean, you've asked a very big question. I just put my email in the chat in terms of,
Okay,
how to get in touch around folks that you're in touch with and as part of the Grail movement. We'd love to be in touch. I mean, I think, we don't know, we don't have precise answers. I think we think it's all of the above of what you've said. I think there were questions. Carbon sequestration is not in our playbook, but the other things are, in addition to, the fact that we need to use a lot less, and we need to be thinking a lot more about leisure, and like what's to be gained if we build, like it is about building public transportation and not like, we're not just trying to convert every car in the US that's foolhardy into an electric vehicle. That's not going to be sufficient. What is going to be sufficient is building mass public transportation. Also, that's class privilege. If everyone gets to give the people who have cars, they just buy more cars. Like we need ways for everyone to get around. We need ways to democratize how agriculture works. So a lot of our work in the US around solutions is we're taking it in a very specific way, which is how do we help get the Inflation Reduction Act implemented? How do we make sure that it's being implemented in a fair way? So for example, Minnesota 350 is pushing to make sure that the funds that are coming into Minneapolis are going to North Minneapolis, which is predominantly African-American neighborhood first, and that the city's thinking about doing its conversion in a way where folks who have benefited the least can benefit the most. So some of it's just about, step one is implementation of some of the things that we have, because for all of its problems, the Inflation Reduction Act is a huge win, and then making sure who gets access to that. And that's not just about solar panels. That's also about weatherization of homes, so utility bills go down. That's about, and retrofits. It's about public transportation. It's about all of those things. So that's what we're trying to figure out. And that doesn't preclude anything else we're trying to do. And I think that's what's exciting about having so many chapters or local groups of 350 is that you all are going to figure out some things on the ground that isn't just about stopping the bad, but also what are interesting local solutions, particularly based on the influx of money that's coming in. And I would encourage you all in New Jersey and wherever else folks are calling in from to try to figure that out. And I think there's a lot of expertise I'm betting on this call. And there's a lot of local governments and state governments where there's some ability to access them, trying to figure out what to do with the funds that are coming in innovative ways. And I think we don't know yet. We've just begun to scratch the surface. And so I hope folks can start to think about that. And we can take some ideas and move them forward in a significant way across the organization and share them.
Thanks. Thanks, Trina, for your question, and Jeff. Jane, and then Jordan, and then we probably need to kind of touch base on if we're going to wrap up after an hour. That's generally what we thought we would do, but it may be if there's other questions, we could go a little bit longer. But so Jane, and then Jordan. You're Jane, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Hello, everybody. I'm Jane Califf. I'm in Bloomfield, New Jersey, and I'm with 350 and J. Rockland for a number of years now. And first of all, I really want to thank James for being here. I've not seen James in decades. He was my supervisor when in elementary school where there were a million problems, and he was very helpful. So thanks, James, again, after all these years. And I also want to thank Winnie for mentioning that white people have to be more careful and more sensitive, is basically what I got from what Winnie said. Winnie's a friend of mine, so she's helped me a lot to understand things that I wasn't quite clear on. And that we as white people have to listen more and not just show up and think we, because of historic reasons, have more ideas than the people that we're trying to help. I think we have to listen a lot and then ask them how we can be helpful. So thanks, Winnie, for making me think this and say it. My main question, however, is what is the role of 350.org nationally on the military? Because the military is polluting the world, the US military especially, with 700 bases or more, and all that pollution that involves. And we're in so many wars polluting the air, water, and land. And it seems that historically, the environmental movement, climate movement, and the peace movement are like doing all their own thing separately. So what we did here in 350 NJ Rockland is we invited Veterans for Peace. They have a whole program of a slide presentation on the role of on how the military is related to climate change. It was very helpful for us to do that and to make us start to think about what we can do to not just talk about the climate change and the threat and the fossil fuel threat, but actually talk about how the military of our country is one of the worst polluters in the entire world. So is 350.org nationally looking into this?
Yes, but you want a better answer than that, Jane. So there are two things you say I wanted to respond to. So the first, we see the issues as connected. We see having devoted, what is a limited staff time for someone who is thinking about how we fit in to the world, right? How we're lifting up struggles in the global South and getting folks here in the US to support those. We think that the sheer number, I wish I knew off the top of my head, the thousands of military bases around the world and the role of the US military and how pernicious it is going to come up and is going to be part of the program that we have. So not just dealing with them as a source of carbon, but the interrelated, and I know what someone, I think it was Marianne, put in the chat around, the coup in Bolivia. We're going to see more and more pushing back around sovereignty. I mean, we're seeing this in the US around indigenous sovereignty, but global sovereignty of nations to control their natural resources. We're going to see that. So the military is a huge problem and we need to figure out how to combat it. And we don't know yet, but we think it's a thing that we're thinking about and spending time and attention thinking about it. I know others are too. I know Ted and maybe you were one of the folks who helped convene this call to think about the role, the particularly pernicious role of the military. The second thing is I've spent a number of years doing as part of the leadership team with the equivalent of the board for a group called Showing Up.
Compostel@AOL.com.
Right. Tina, could you mute, please? Thanks, Tina.
At Showing Up for Racial Justice, so the equivalent of the board, the sort of group for white folks moving into action. And I think where there's the subtlety of what we need to do, there is a nuance, which is we both need to listen more, and that can't be an excuse for inaction. So it is, there's this sort of, we always told the story of like the white folks sitting in a room waiting for the phone to ring and waiting to be called to act. And in fact, like we have some suppositions about what we need to do to act. And it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to step forward. It's okay to step into risk. Because if we don't do that, we can't grow, we can't learn. And most of all, we can't create the level of agitation and the scale of action that is needed if what we're waiting for is particularly groups that are incredibly busy and under-resourced to always be telling us exactly what to do. So we need relationships, but we don't necessarily need to be told every step of the way once we have relationships where we live or where we're doing work to move into action and to move into the maximum amount of action that we can take. So I just want to lift up that nuance there from my point of view.
Okay, thanks. So perhaps the last speaker may be Jordan. Again, if somebody else, especially who hasn't spoken, would like to ask a question, we may have a little more time. It is almost 8. But Jordan, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Jeff, nice to meet you. I'm hearing a lot of ideas. I think they're all great from you, from other speakers, but there's something missing for me, and I want to challenge you on it. To me, the thing that 350 National brought early in its existence was that it was a huge consciousness raiser on the issue of climate change and impacted hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people who before that didn't know that this was such an urgent issue. And if anything, it's gotten more urgent. Our very existence is threatened. It seems that every time you turn around, it's worse than people thought it was going to be. And I would really like to see 350 National organizing the big, huge on the streets demonstration in Washington, D.C. and New York. I've participated in a couple of those. COVID hit, it kind of shut down the on the streets stuff for a while. And 350, with its connections, its history, and its mission, and its paid staff, albeit much smaller than it used to be, is in a better position than so many other organizations to really raise consciousness and do something big. So that would be the thing that I'm looking for that I'm not hearing. Something big, 1 million people in the street.
Yeah, I think, well, a couple things. I don't know if we realistically think we can put 1 million people in the streets. That being said, there is an attempt. So the Secretary General of the UN has called for a climate summit in mid-September during Climate Week in New York. And we are part of a number of groups that are working very hard to put thousands, hopefully tens of thousands of people in the streets of New York. Sometime the call will come out soon, but
I'll compromise with you. I'll be happy with 100,000. 10,000 is not enough. Shoot big.
Well, I mean, I think the question, I think there's a number of questions around that, which is like, if we put 100,000 people in the streets of New York, does that matter? Have enough people's consciousness been raised, and do we need to do where I'm looking for where I think we should be putting more of our energy into actions is less about New York and DC. I think there's been a lot of attempts to do marches there, and more, how do we think about resistance in Wisconsin, where they're building a gas plant, where there's Line 5, where there's where there's a refinery that exploded 5 years ago and is now reopening. Like, are there points along the line where, in whether that's Mountain Valley Pipeline, whether that's Line 5, there's a bunch of fights that we can lift up that are not in DC and New York. And I think that's where we need to be putting energy. I think there's a lot of groups. I think a lot of the other climate groups will be calling for big actions, and we'll be part of that. But I'm actually interested in putting more people in motion where they live, directly around those kinds of fights.
Okay, so I think Alfred Meyer has his hand up, and Alfred, why don't you be the last question here? We do appreciate, Jeff, your taking the time and the energy you're putting in, and but it seems like, why don't we have Alfred, you be the last question. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And Jeff, thank you. It's a very exciting presentation. Very exciting to learn about the expanded horizons of 350.org. It's always been such an important organization, had such phenomenal energy and organizing principles. And yet I must thank you for saying that you oppose nuclear energy now, because I put in the chat a link to an article I wrote recently, which describes how nuclear energy really is the cover story for nuclear weapons and the nuclear navy. It cannot solve climate change, and I'm so glad that 350 is really addressing the full range of intersectional issues, which certainly the nuclear world personifies. You know, somebody like James Hansen supports nuclear power, but Naomi Klein will tell him, but it's an extractive industry which inherently sacrifices people and places. So onward to a better future. Thank you for your leadership, and I certainly wish you the best of luck with everything.
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks. Thank you, everybody. I'm wondering, Sam, Sam has been kind of behind the scenes doing helpful work to make this all happen. Thanks for that, Sam. And we've recorded this, and could you maybe explain to people? We'll get this information out to everybody who's on our 350 New Jersey Rockland email list, which, by the way, if you're not on it, I guess you could, you should just go to our website, 350, I think it's 350nj.org. That gets you to our website. And you can sign up there for our email list. We actually feel pretty good about one of the things we do, which is every week or two, we do send out an email. That's no more than that, basically, about kind of the latest, really, in terms of what's happening in terms of the movements fighting new fossil fuel infrastructure in New Jersey, and the divestment movements in both New York and in New Jersey, as well as national developments of note. So if people aren't on that list, maybe many of you are, I assume many of you are, we do think it's a helpful list to follow kind of what's happening. And you know, you can get invited to events like this if you're on the list. So please please go to our website and sign up. But Sam, do you just want to tell people if they want to access the recording, to you know, study this again, or to send it to people you know? That would be certainly a good thing. Do you want to just tell people how that's going to be happening, where it'll be, where they could access the recording?
Sure, yeah. I'm gonna put it on 350 New Jersey's YouTube channel and on the Facebook page.
Okay. Jane, do you want to kind of have the last word before we wrap up?
Yes, it's really short. If you want to be in touch with 350 NJ Rockland, you don't do just 350.org. You have to do 350 NJ-Rockland. Because Rockland is on the border of New Jersey, and they didn't have enough people to have their own group, so they joined us.
I do think that the actual website is just 350nj.org, but we are, our group as a whole, yes, is absolutely 350nj-Rockland. So I should know that as kind of the president of this group. But I might not have it quite right. But you know, you can certainly do a Google search for 350 New Jersey-Rockland, and I'm sure you'll find it. Okay, well, again, thank you, everybody. And there's always things coming up. I mean, the movement in New Jersey and the movement in New York, there's a lot happening. Again, we'll keep you informed if you're on our email list, and we do have this Facebook page. And honestly, I didn't even know that we had a YouTube channel. That shows you something about where my limitations. So I'm glad we have one. I'll have to check it out now. So again, thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
And thank you again. Thank you, Jeff, very much.